The first thing you need to know about Ensign Kael Morrow is that he was not supposed to be there. Not on the bridge. Not on that ship. Not anywhere near the Velan corridor on the 14th day of what the historians would later call the First Boundary War, though at the time nobody was calling it anything because nobody had decided yet whether it was going to be a war or an incident or a catastrophe or some combination of all three. Kael Morrow was 19 years old, 4 months out of the accelerated officer training program that the human unified fleet had thrown together in the 18 months, since the Keth Dominion had made clear that the outer colonies were going to be contested territory. And he was assigned to the navigation station of the HUF Resolute, because the Resolute's regular navigator had developed a cardiac event 6 hours before departure, and the only warm body with the right clearances and enough training hours to sit in that seat was a 19-year-old ensign who had graduated 42nd in a class of 44, and who had, as his training supervisor noted in his file with the kind of institutional honesty that serves no one well in a crisis, demonstrated adequate competence in all required areas and exceptional competence in none of them. The second thing you need to know about Kael Morrow is that he knew all of this about himself. He was not the kind of 19-year-old who mistakes being in the room for being ready for the room. He had read his own file. He had heard his training supervisor's assessment, not the written version but the spoken one, delivered in the particular tone of someone trying to be encouraging about a situation that did not encourage easily. He knew he was the 42nd best navigator in a class of 44. He knew he was on the Resolute because someone better was unavailable. He knew that the Velan corridor was the most strategically contested piece of space in the current conflict, and that the Resolute's mission, to establish and hold a navigational relay point that would give the human fleet a significant communications advantage in the outer system, was exactly the kind of mission that attracted exactly the kind of attention that a 19-year-old ensign with adequate competence in all required areas was not equipped to handle. He knew all of this. He sat down at the navigation station anyway. He pulled up his charts. He ran his pre-departure checks. He did his job because his job was what was in front of him, and the alternative was to leave the seat empty, and an empty seat helped no one. General Voth-Karaan of the Keth Dominion's 3rd Assault Fleet was 407 years old, which by the standards of his species was middle-aged, and which by the standards of military experience meant that he had been commanding combat operations since before the human species had developed writing. He had fought in 31 wars across 6 star systems. He had developed tactical doctrines that were still taught at the Dominion's war colleges as foundational texts. He had a reputation within the Dominion's military hierarchy for 2 things: absolute tactical precision and absolute contempt for opponents he considered beneath his attention. The human fleet, in his assessment, fell firmly into the second category. He had reviewed the intelligence files on the human unified fleet with the thoroughness that 4 centuries of military experience required and the dismissiveness that 4 centuries of winning produced. And his conclusion, filed with Dominion Command 3 weeks before the engagement at the Velan corridor, was that the humans were a young species with serviceable equipment, adequate training, and no meaningful combat experience, and that the 3rd Assault Fleet's objectives in the outer system could be achieved with minimal resource expenditure and no significant risk to Dominion personnel. He was not careless. He was not negligent. He was simply applying 400 years of accurate judgment to a situation that would turn out to be the first situation in 400 years to which his judgment did not apply. The Resolute arrived at the Velan corridor on schedule, 14 hours ahead of the rest of the task force, which was the plan. The relay point needed to be established and secured before the main fleet moved up, and the Resolute was fast enough and small enough to do it without attracting the kind of immediate response that a larger force would trigger. Captain Adiz Okonkwo, who had 20 years of fleet experience and a manner that combined absolute calm with absolute clarity in proportions that Kael had never encountered before and suspected he was unlikely to encounter again, briefed the crew on the approach at 600-hour ship time. She described the situation without minimizing it. The corridor was contested. Dominion patrol assets had been detected in the area within the past 72 hours. The relay install. Asian would take approximately 4 hours to deploy and calibrate. During those 4 hours, the Resolute would be stationary, which made them a fixed target, and the task force would not be in position to support them. She said all of this plainly, and then she said, "We do our job, we do it well, and we get out. Any questions?" There were none. Kael sat at his station and thought about the 4 hours and what a fixed target meant, and then he stopped thinking about it and focused on his charts, because the charts were his job and his job was what was in front of him. The Dominion patrol vessel found them in the second hour of the deployment. It was a Scout-class ship, faster and lighter than the Resolute, running without full sensor signature, which was why their own long-range detection had missed it. It came out of the debris field on the corridor's northern edge at a speed that told Kael, before anyone said anything, that it had known they were there and had been approaching for some time. He had the new heading calculated, and on the captain's screen before the contact alarm finished sounding. Not because he was the fastest navigator in his class. Because he had spent the first 2 hours of the deployment running contingency calculations for exactly this scenario. Not because anyone told him to, but because the 4 hours and the fixed target and the 72-hour patrol data had been sitting in the back of his mind since the briefing, and he was the kind of person who, when something was sitting in the back of his mind, did something about it. The captain glanced at the screen, glanced at him, and said, "Good work." It was the first time anyone had said that to Kael Morrow about anything in a professional context, and he noted it and filed it, and did not let himself feel it until later, because later was when there was time for feeling things. The Scout did not engage. It broadcast a contact report and pulled back to the edge of sensor range, which was what Scouts did, and what it meant was that within the hour they would have more company than a Scout. Captain Okonkwo assessed the situation in approximately 30 seconds and made a decision that Kael would spend years thinking about afterward. She did not abort the mission. The relay was 60% deployed. Aborting meant leaving 60% of an installation in the corridor for the Dominion to find and exploit, and it meant the task force moved up without communications advantage, and it meant everything that would happen in the next 72 hours happened without the relay, and the captain had clearly done the same calculation Kael had done and arrived at the same conclusion. She ordered the deployment team to accelerate the timeline. She ordered the weapons systems to full readiness. She ordered Kael to give her every possible exit vector ranked by probability of success. And she said it the way she said everything, with the absolute calm that made it sound like a routine request. And Kael pulled up his contingency calculations and started ranking them and thought, "I have been running these numbers for 2 hours because something was sitting in the back of my mind. And the captain has been running them since before the briefing because this is what 20 years looks like. And we are going to be fine, or we are not going to be fine. But either way, we are going to do our jobs." Voth-Karaan received his Scout's contact report and dispatched 2 assault-class vessels, which was more than sufficient for a single human ship of the Resolute's class, and which he calibrated specifically to be more than sufficient, without being so overwhelming as to constitute a serious resource commitment to what he considered a minor interdiction. He was not on the assault vessels. He was on the command ship, 20 light minutes away, receiving data feeds and making decisions with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been making decisions from command ships for 4 centuries. He expected the interdiction to take approximately 40 minutes. He expected the human vessel to either flee, which would leave the relay installation incomplete and recoverable, or stand and be destroyed, which would achieve the same result with the added benefit of removing 1 human ship from the order of battle. He did not consider the possibility of a third outcome because, in 400 years of combat operations, he had encountered very few third outcomes that his planning had not anticipated, and he had reviewed the intelligence on the Resolute and he knew her class, her armament, her speed, and her crew complement, and none of it suggested a third outcome was available. The Resolute did not flee and was not destroyed. What she did, in the 47 minutes between the arrival of the two assault vessels and the arrival of the task force's advance element, was something that Voth-Karaan would later spend considerable time trying to categorize using the tactical frame. Works he had developed over 4 centuries and would ultimately conclude could not be categorized using those frameworks because it was not, by any strict definition, tactics. It was improvisation. Specifically, it was the improvisation of a crew that had decided, without anyone formally making the decision, that they were going to finish their job, and that everything between them and the end of their job was a problem to be solved rather than a situation to be escaped. The relay deployment continued throughout the engagement, which meant the engineering team was doing their job while the weapons teams were doing theirs, which meant the captain was coordinating 2 simultaneous and partially incompatible sets of requirements, with the communications officer relaying between them, which meant Kael was managing approach vectors for 2 hostile vessels while plotting the exit vector they were going to need the moment the relay was fully deployed, which was not something the navigation training program had included a specific module for. The first assault vessel made 3 attack runs. The Resolute's point defense handled the first, the captain's evasive maneuvering compromised the second, and the third connected and took out their port shielding array and part of the secondary propulsion system. Kael felt the hit through the deck plating and recalculated the exit vectors without being asked. Because the exit vectors he had ranked assumed full propulsion capability, and the ship he was navigating now had partial propulsion capability. And the difference mattered, and his job was the difference. The damage control report came in at the same time as the weapons officer's assessment that they had successfully degraded the first assault vessel's forward sensor array, which meant it was operating partially blind, which the captain used immediately by moving into the blind spot and holding position there, while the second vessel tried to reacquire them. Kael watched this on his screen and thought, she is using the debris field on the corridor's northern edge for cover at the same time as she is using the first vessel's blind spot, and those 2 things are working together, and she decided to do this while I was recalculating exit vectors, and I do not know how someone carries that much in their head at the same time. The relay finished deployment at the 41-minute mark, 6 minutes ahead of the accelerated timeline. The engineer who sent the completion signal to the bridge had been doing her job in a compartment that had lost internal atmosphere management 18 minutes earlier, and had spent those 18 minutes in an emergency suit while finishing her job, which Kael did not know until afterward, and which, when he found out, reorganized several things he thought he understood about what people were capable of. The captain received the completion signal and said, "Navigation, give me exit vector 3, and Kael had it on the helm already because he had been watching the deployment progress and had been ready with vector 3 for 4 minutes, and the Resolute moved, with her compromised propulsion and her absent port shielding, in the direction that gave her the most distance from both assault vessels in the shortest time. And the task force's advance element dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the 47-minute mark, and the engagement ended as quickly as it had begun. Voth-Karaan received the engagement report and read it 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand, because it was difficult to accept. 1 human ship of moderate class, with a crew of 91, the majority of whom had been in active service for less than 2 years, had held position against 2 Dominion assault vessels for 47 minutes, completed their primary mission objective, sustained significant but not catastrophic damage, and extracted without losing a single crew member. He pulled up the tactical data from the assault vessel's recordings and reviewed it in detail, looking for the thing that explained it, the decision or the weapon or the capability that he had not accounted for. He did not find it. What he found in the data was not a single decision but a continuous series of decisions, small and fast, and each one building on the last, none of them individually exceptional, all of them collectively producing something that his frameworks had categorized as statistically unlikely, and that had happened anyway. He filed a revised intelligence assessment with Dominion Command that afternoon. The assessment upgraded the human unified fleet's combat effectiveness, rating from adequate to significant, and recommended that future engagement planning account for human adaptability as a primary rather than secondary variable. Dominion Command acknowledged the report. They did not change the engagement schedule. Kael Morrow was summoned to the captain's quarters 4 hours after the Resolute docked with the Task Force's command station. He went expecting a debrief, which was standard after an engagement, and instead found himself sitting across from Captain Okonkwo, who had a cup of something hot in her hands and the specific expression of someone who has decided to have a real conversation rather than an official one. She asked him about the contingency calculations. He told her the truth, that he had started running them during the briefing because something was sitting in the back of his mind, and that was how he handled things sitting in the back of his mind. She nodded as if this was a satisfying answer and asked him what else was sitting in the back of his mind. He thought about it honestly and said, "Everything, mostly." She smiled, which was not an expression he had seen from her before, and said that was either the right answer or a problem, and she suspected it was the right answer. She told him that his exit vector recalculation after the third hit had been the fastest she had seen in 20 years, and that the ranking he had given the vectors before the engagement had been better than her own, which she had been running since she read the mission briefing. He did not know what to say to that. She told him he did not need to say anything, that she was telling him so he knew, and that what he did with knowing was his business. The Velan Corridor engagement became a case study at the Fleet Academy within 18 months of its conclusion, which meant that Kael Morrow's contingency calculations and the sequence of decisions that Captain Okonkwo had made in 47 minutes were analyzed by thousands of students over the following decades. Kael did not know this for several years because he was not at the academy, he was on ships, doing his job in the various places his job required him to be, getting better at it in the way that people get better at things when they take the work seriously and are honest with themselves about where they fall short. He made lieutenant at 22, which was not exceptional. He made commander at 27, which was. He took his first captaincy at 31, during a period of renewed Dominion pressure on the outer colonies, and the first thing he did after assuming command was brief his crew in the manner that Captain Okonkwo had briefed hers, plainly and without minimizing, and then he asked if there were any questions, and when there were none, he sat down at the navigation station himself and started running contingency calculations. Because something was sitting in the back of his mind, and that was how he handled it. Voth-Karaan engaged the human fleet directly 4 times in the 3 years following the Velan Corridor incident. He won 2 of those engagements and lost 2, which was a record that in 4 centuries of combat he had never come close to approaching, his win rate across his career being so lopsided toward victory that the losses stood as events of genuine significance in his own professional self-understanding. He began studying the human fleet with the same thoroughness he had previously reserved for opponents he considered genuinely dangerous, which was an adjustment that cost him something he did not easily name, the particular confidence that 4 centuries of being right produces, the sense that your judgment is so calibrated by experience that the calibration itself is the answer. The humans kept producing situations where the calibration was not the answer, not because they were more powerful, because they were faster in ways that power did not measure, because the gap between a problem appearing and a human response emerging was shorter than any equivalent gap he had observed in any other species, and the responses were not predictable from the inputs, which meant his models of human behavior needed to be rebuilt after every engagement rather than refined, because the rebuilding was the point. The humans did not fight the same battle twice. He requested a meeting with the human fleet commander in the 4th year of what was now formally designated a war. The request was unusual. A Dominion general did not typically seek direct communication with enemy commanders during active operations, and it was received with appropriate suspicion on the human side. But it was ultimately granted because the human fleet commander, a woman named Admiral Usul Chen, who had been fighting the Dominion for 11 years, and who had developed her own extensive file on Voth-Karaan, determined that the request was genuine and that the conversation might be useful. They spoke for 2 hours via secure channel. Voth-Karaan asked Chen, with the directness that 4 centuries had made habitual, what she believed the humans were doing differently that he had failed to account for. Chen thought about the question for a long moment and then said, "We don't fight to win. We fight to learn. Every engagement is information. We go into every fight expecting to be surprised, and we're ready for the surprise to teach us something. You go in expecting to be right. When you're right, you win. When you're not right, you lose time learning what you should have already known. We just learn faster than you lose." Voth-Karaan sat with that assessment for 3 days before he responded to it, which was itself a departure from his standard practice, and his response, when it came, was shorter than Chen had expected. He said, "I have been fighting for 400 years. I have won more engagements than you have years of experience. I am telling you this not to argue with your analysis, but to tell you what it costs to hear it." She said she understood. He said he did not think she did, but that he believed her assessment was correct, and that he had filed a recommendation with Dominion Command to pursue formal ceasefire negotiations. She asked why he was telling her. He said, "Because you should know that the recommendation was rejected, and that I am going to keep fighting because I am a soldier and that is what I do, and that I am going to keep losing ground because you are right about the learning, and I wanted to have said this to someone who would understand what it meant before the outcome made it obvious." She said she would note the conversation in her records. He said he would note it in his. The war ended 22 months later with a negotiated settlement that gave the human colonies in the outer system recognized status under a bilateral framework, which was not a Dominion victory, and was not a human victory in any simple sense, but was, by every honest accounting, the result that the human fleet's consistent operational performance had made inevitable once Dominion Command accepted that the resource cost of continuing was not going to decrease. Kael Morrow was 33 years old at the signing, commanding a cruiser that had been in 12 engagements over the previous 4 years, and he read the settlement terms in his quarters and thought about the 19-year-old who had sat at a navigation station in the Velan corridor and run contingency calculations because something was sitting in the back of his mind. He thought about Captain Okonkwo and the 47 minutes and the exit vectors and the engineer in the emergency suit finishing her job. He thought about all the people who had done their jobs in the years between then and now, the thousands of decisions made fast and small, and each one building on the last, none of them individually exceptional, all of them collectively producing something that had apparently been difficult to account for. He did not think of it as a victory, exactly. He thought of it as the result of a very large number of people deciding, repeatedly and without much fanfare, that the thing in front of them was their job and their job was what mattered, and then doing it. Voth-Karaan retired from active command 6 months after the settlement. His retirement address to the 3rd Assault Fleet was brief by the standards of the speeches that Dominion generals customarily gave, and the part of it that was subsequently quoted most often in the histories of the conflict was also the shortest part. He said, "I have spent 400 years being certain about what war requires and what victory looks like and what an enemy is capable of. I have spent 4 years being wrong about all 3. I do not say this as a confession. I say it as the most important thing I learned in 400 years, which is that certainty is not the same as preparation, and that a species which knows it does not know what is coming and prepares for that instead of for the thing it expects is a species that will keep surprising you until you run out of surprises to be wrong about. I was wrong about the humans. I will not be the last. There is a final thing about Kael Morrow, something that does not appear in the official records of the war, or in the Academy case study of the Velon corridor engagement, or in any of the historical analyses that were written in the decades following the settlement. On the day the ceasefire was formally announced, Kael was on his ship, and one of his junior officers, a young woman of 20 who had been in the fleet for less than a year and who reminded him, in ways he found occasionally difficult of himself at that age, asked him what it felt like. He thought about the question carefully, the way Captain Okonkwo had thought about questions when she wanted to give a real answer rather than an official one. He said, "It feels like we did our jobs." She said that seemed like not enough to feel, given everything. He said, "When you're in it, the job is everything. The job is what you have. The job is what keeps the people next to you alive and the mission moving forward and the situation from becoming worse than it already is." He paused and looked at his navigation charts for a moment and then said, "The job is just the job, but the job won well by enough people who take it seriously is how you get from here to somewhere better." She said she understood. He was not sure she did, but he thought she would eventually, and that was how it worked, and that was enough.